Good morning. Thank you, Greg. I think it's very nice to start this stepping back over the season with your broad global view. So what I'm going to try to do is to dissect how the trends that you have highlighted on a global scale did apply and modified the vine physiological cycle, and also ponder its consequences in terms of fruit composition. In order to do that, I'm going to try to simplify things. When we try to look at a time series, like a vintage, we can actually slice this time series into three very obvious transitional phases. The first one is when apparently nothing happens in the vine. It's in blue, it's the dormancy. It ends with bud break. Then we have this part during which most of the radiations helps building biomass. This is the green side, the green slice, during which most of the vegetative development occurs. And then we have past veraison, the moment in time where there is this shift, how energy from the sky is allocated via the leaves to either the carbohydrates and the storage of reserves, or the fruit sink capabilities are actually a main signaling center to get this energy. So during maturation, we have this shift where the coexistence of sink and sources shifts a little bit plant responses to climate. Okay. So to be going a bit more in depth, those three very broad transitional phases can be sliced a bit further. The dormancy, for now, we'll keep it as one whole period. However, the green section during which vegetative development occurs can be divided into two subsections. The first period is the period during which most of the nutrients are actively pumped into the leaf area. It's also the moment in time when the speed at which leaf area develops sets the stage for how quickly maturation will kick in. And then we have the period number 3. This is the sweet spot. This is really what makes a wine growing region being what it is years in, years out. But it's also this period 3 that shapes what makes a vintage for a specific wine growing region different from the other. During this period 3, we no longer have an active leaf area development. And it's before veraison kicks in, so the fruit is not yet a sink, and actually the clusters still have a photosynthetic activity. However, during that stage, stresses coming from lack of water, lack of nitrogen, or even other abiotic stresses, high cluster exposure to light or to temperature, will deeply modify the way fruit composition will end up being at harvest. And then we switch onto the part during which the fruit has become a sink. In orange, we have this part during which sugar is actively loading into the berry. And then once sugars are no longer actively loading, we go into that phase during which anthocyanin keeps accumulating, and harvest and leaf fall ends the period 5. So in order to characterize the length and duration and start date and end date of those 5 periods, we come up with 8 developmental stages. 4 of them are visible. They are called the phenological stages: bud break, bloom, veraison, and harvest. 4 of them are physiological stages. They are naked to the eye. They are not visible to the naked eye. But the first one is the end of leaf nitrogen uptake. Typically, that occurs before leaf area unfolds to its largest point, which is the point number 6. Technically, in the literature, people refer to it as maximum basal crop coefficient. So looking at the timing of stage 5 versus stage 6 and how much time there is between those two will also bear some information as far as how the vintage will unfold. And then we have stage 7, which is not Brix, which is really how much sugar is actively feeding in a berry that maybe has already achieved its maximal size. And then we have the end of color accumulation, that is how the berry skin surface is accumulating anthocyanins. To put things in perspective, this is how the growing degree days have distributed themselves all along the season. So the numbers I have put here come from regional statistics over the entire Napa Valley. On average, we observed a late bud break date, which is when we started the clock in terms of heat accumulation. So 1 growing degree days is 1 day spent with an average temperature of 11 Celsius. And if average temperature during 1 day is 20 Celsius, then we accumulate 10 growing degree days. So minimum average temperature below 10 degrees Celsius is neutral for the plant. You see that it's around the solstice that we hit 500 growing degree days. You see that it's around the beginning of August that we hit the 1,000 growing degree days mark. And based on the Vivelis database, we know that it's on average around the end of August that the berries have stopped actively calling for sugar loading. For the sake of the time frame, I put October 15 just as a reference, where you see we had reached the 1,700 growing degree days bar. So now I'm going to use that to walk through the season and at each stage try to build inferences in terms of how climate variables are driving a specific plant response. So with that framework in mind, let's dive into period 1. So I'm not going to go through each and every climatic variables that there are. I have just decided to highlight the most important one. If here you look at the 5 most recent vintages, what's very apparent is that during the winter, there was a lot of moisture supply. That's it. The take-home number 1 we can get from that already before bud break is that microbes won't be slowed down in their ability to convert mineral nitrogen into plant-available nitrogen. That means that the pool of plant-available nitrogen at the start of the season will be high. That means that it's unlikely to observe deficit in nitrogen uptake, at least from an initial pool of nitrogen standpoint. I'm not talking of how well this nitrogen will circulate, but I'm saying that the initial pool is expected to be large. Let's focus on period 2. And unlike what I have been doing in the previous years, I think now it's time to be a little bit more complex in understanding what period 2 has to say. So really, when I speak about period 2, I should really speak about period 2 in 2019, but also in 2018. And here is why. If you look at the work started by Carmo Vasconcelos and up until today with Cécile Laurent, you see that the potential for yield is the consequences not only of the current year, but there is a memory effect from the previous year. And more particularly, the strongest footprint to determine the yield potential in 2019 comes from a window of time that occurs during period 2. This is what this graph is showing. You see that during the season 1, so for us, season 2018, we have this period of time in green during which inflorescences starts to be programmed into the compound bud. And the size and the number of clusters, which on your right explains up to 90% of the yield components, are actually influenced by the severity of stresses from water, from nitrogen, or from temperature experienced in 2018 during that phase. And then the compound bud goes dormant until season 2, so season 2019 kicks in again. So we understand that there is going to be a long-lasting effect of period 2 last year to understand the yield potential in 2019. So the only thing we need to understand at this point is that, okay, cluster numbers and cluster size is something inherited from 2018. The only thing that's going to be directly bearing the footprint of 2019 is the berry size. But 90% or so of the yield potential is the consequence of a long-lasting effect of period 2. And to be a little bit more specific, recent work have highlighted that it's the second half of period 2. In fact, it's really the period stretching between 400 growing degree days up until 700 to 800 growing degree days post-bud break. So I'm going to look at that specific phase. Focusing first on growing degree days, this is the picture we get. It looks like 2019 is slightly lower than previous years, but nothing really striking. However, if we slice a bit further, here is the big difference. You see that in May, we are on average 50 to 70 growing degree days in deficit. What does that mean? That means that the speed at which biomass will unfold and develops to have either more leaves but also more roots will strongly be affected by this lack of heat accumulation. So the consequence from that is that not only did we have a low heat accumulation, which slows down all the processes of leaf area development, but we also have a similar cumulated value in 19 than in 18, which means that we then sped up much faster, which is also what Greg has shown. We had spikes in June 10th, June 11th in terms of elevated temperature. What should we take home from that? Well, is that May 2019 was a very cold period which induced a lag in leaf area development rate. That's what sometimes was puzzling for us. We were wondering if this delay in setting up the canopy was bearing the footprint of the climate or bearing the footprint of nutrients deficit or some other disease pressure or abiotic stress. But essentially, it was just showing that heat accumulation had been extremely slow compared to the previous years, which visibly looks like the vineyard is not pushing. We also observed that we caught up in June and July. That means that during the longest days of the year, June 21st being the longest, we had more photons and more temperature. So that explains why we have this explosive leaf area development rate, which are the two take-homes I highlight here. The delay observed in heat accumulation during May will actually affect the entire season, and we'll see in a minute what it means. And it also means that by the end of May, we already knew that we were going to have a longer lasting period 2, simply because we had accumulated so much delayed in May. Which means in terms of canopy manipulation, we could already be set up for postponing our canopy manipulation, at least from a leaf architectural standpoint. We talked about the climate demand, but let's look at the water supply. That's the other side of the coin. Okay, there was more water than we had observed. So again, those are the statistics from hundreds of weather stations in Napa. So when it departs from what Greg has shown, it's because we have locally growing conditions that may not reflect the average trends. So same amount of water as 17, a little bit more. But as Nova was saying, what matters is not so much the amount of water, it's the distribution. And here is the key footprint of 2019. You see that compared to the previous years, if we focus on the second period, the second half of period 2, we had these 40 to 50 excess in terms of water supply. So this 67 millimeter of water will have a huge impact on leaf area development kinetics. So in order to wrap this up, it means that before we entered this switch window that will set the bird fertility potential for 2020, in 2019, we had just got heavy rainfall, which means that we should not expect in 2019 any reduction in leaf area development caused by water deficit. This means that in most sites there was no need to irrigate, and maybe you could have factored in the heavy rainfall on high vigor sites as a reason to postpone cover crop removal. The good news is that for low water holding capacity sites, you have an opportunity to delay the first irrigation. And the first irrigation is what commands the durations of period 3. So this brings me to my take-home number 3. What can we extract from period 2? Well, slow heat accumulation drives a delay in leaf area development. Then, combined with the important rainfall and the high temperature accumulation in June, an explosive development of leaf area. At this point, it's a situation that is a bit outside of our habits, because here is the trick. Nutrients, and more particularly nitrogen, in general stops accumulating before leaf area sets up its final size. So what if we have an explosive leaf area development after nitrogen stops being accumulated? Are we going to have an initial amount of nitrogen being diluted into more biomass, therefore observing lower petiole number, lower leaf nitrogen concentration, lower photosynthetic activity? Or actually, is there enough nitrogen to compensate for the slow and delayed leaf elongation period? It's something we could not guess. At this point, when we were in the solstice, I couldn't say if the year was going to be conducive to nitrogen deficit, or if the initial pool being high due to the high winter rain was actually going to compensate for the slow and delayed leaf area growth. So what did we do? We actually, over many sites in Napa, weekly came and perform fluorescence measurements on the leaves. So what we are doing here is exciting some compounds inside the leaves of the same vines and see how much chlorophyll and how much nitrogen is being accumulated from one week to the next. And this is a typical trend that is being collected at the leaf area level. You see that when the green line is increasing, it means that per square centimeter, each leaf area is accumulating more nitrogen, which directly affects photosynthetic activity, up until a point in time when a peak is being reached. And then as the leaf ages, you see from approximately 7 to 800 growing degree days, it's extremely site and vintage dependent, we have this downfall. So we are trying to understand when this peak is observed, and we are also trying to characterize this value. What I can tell you is that this peak had never been reached so late in 2019. And what we also found is that if you look at average value of peak leaf area nitrogen content, it's as high as, it's between 17 and 16 for Cabernet, and it's the highest we had observed for Merlot. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the initial pool of nitrogen plus the high supply of water were sufficient to avoid any nutrients deficit that could have been induced by too much biomass diluting the initial amount of nutrients. It was a general trend observed in Napa, and it means two things. It means that the plant had delayed the moment when it stops accumulating nitrogen, and that initially we had those bombs in terms of nitrogen-rich plants, and it's thanks to this delayed in leaf area development that we ended up with numbers that were in a similar range of value as 2016. That leads me not only to the fourth take-home, but also to a very important question. Okay, we have a large leaf area. It takes time to develop. This leaf area is boosted with nitrogen, and we know that it's a consequence of the nitrogen conditions at the soil level. We have basically extremely well-performing photosynthetic machinery. How is this machine going to work? Is this going to preferentially benefit the making of more green stuff, more reserves, more starch? Or is it actually going to divert this ability to create a lot of chemical energy towards the making of the fruit? We didn't know. So in order to understand a little bit better how the shift between diverting chemical energy towards biomass or towards fruit, we are going to analyze period 3. Why? Because period 3 is actually the moment in time where the stress will tell the plant, okay, now it's time to divert your energy towards the fruit. Or no, actually, there is no incentive for us to divert energy towards the fruit, so let's make more leaves and have more proteins building up our ability to capture light. And this leads me to a very important hallmark of 2019. We try to analyze when the plant stops investing its energy towards the building of more leaves. How do we do that? Well, we use the relative increase in vine transpiration for a given climatic demand. Technically speaking, we use the amount of sap flowing into the plant divided by the climatic demand to see if days in, days out, the plant is putting more leaves to transpire, which translates into the first part of this graph. You see that as time goes by, on a daily basis, the plant is using a greater fraction of the climatic demand to vaporize water in the air. So that means, technically speaking, that the transpiration ratio, the amount of water used measured by sap flow divided by the climatic demand, which is obtained by your weather data, is going gradually from 20% to 50% or to whatever number is actually reflective of the size of your plant leaf area. And then you see that as we hit that peak, which is the moment in time where the crop coefficient on a per plant basis is at its highest, the plant starts to down-regulating its water use. It's not because it loses water, it's because stomata conductance regulation kicks in. This downward slope, when it starts to inflex, that's when period 3 starts. What did we observe in 2019? Well, we observed two things. We observed that the value of the transpiration ratio was on average the highest we've ever had, which is not a surprise because we have those huge canopies boosted with high nitrogen content, so photosynthetic ability and transpiration ability are their highest. So very high KCB max, very high transpiring leaf area size. On top of that, we observe, because last year, 2018, we also had no stresses during period 2, a high potential for bud fertility. However, despite the fact that the crop load looks relatively high, we had proportionally a greater amount of energy diverted towards the leaf area. And I know that because the KCB max are higher. So that means that when you think about your crop thinning manipulation, maybe you're going to have a greater impact by reducing the transpiring leaf area than by reducing the amount of clusters. The second thing, which is key for flavonoids biosynthesis, is that because KCB max are reached after the solstice, we are probably going to enter into the veraison with almost zero stress. And that is unique to 2019. We saw that in 2011 and 2010, that's all. We haven't seen that anywhere since. That means that in most sites, period 3 is either short for the weak vigor sites or absent in most sites. So if I try to translate that in terms of practical consequences in 2019, that means that number one, because of this explosive leaf area development boosted with nitrogen, and also because of the carryover effect of 2018 making the year more conducive to a higher cluster number and a higher cluster size, crop thinning is probably not going to be as impactful as it would be in a year where leaf area development is more moderate. That's simply because the ratio leaf to fruit is skewed towards more leaves. Reducing the amount of fruit has therefore less critical effect on the vine balance. However, it is a year where canopy manipulation is huge. It's very impactful, and we should expect a strong effect. First, because as Nova was saying, it will have a great impact at lowering disease pressure, which in turn will drive the amount of light that early berries pre-veraison are going to be exposed to. And we know that the biosynthesis of flavonol and the pool of precursors to anthocyanins and tannins is set by veraison. So the total amount of flavonoids is set by veraison and is a direct reflection of nitrogen, water stresses, and exposure to global radiations. And there is a beautiful paper from Luca Briante on that. And then the effect of timing. If you perform your canopy manipulation during period 2, chances are high that you're going to have to come back because you know that June will be conducive to this explosive leaf area development. So coming too early may be a downside in terms of management cost because you may have to come for a second pass or a third pass. Doing your canopy manipulation during period 3 is an extremely interesting tool. If you come early during period 3, that means you will lower the transpiring leaf area. If you lower the transpiring leaf area, you keep more water in the root reservoir for later. So you moderate the severity of water deficit during period 3. You help getting larger berries at the end of the season in period 5. So timing your canopy manipulation during period 3 will have consequences on the berry sizing. And if you decide to reduce your transpiring leaf area towards the end of period 3, then what you're doing is speeding up the rate at which soil moisture content is being depleted. So you are actually hastening the onset of water deficit before veraison, which is what you want to do if you want to reduce berry size and if you want to boost color accumulation and potential flavonoid content. So here we are entering this very interesting window where it wasn't so much a play on irrigation, but rather a play on modifying the size of the transpiring leaf area that could induce more or less stress in the context of 2019. It would not have been the case in 2016 or earlier, for instance. So what makes 2019 a particularly challenging year is that we had almost no period 3. We observed period 3 in the weakest vigor sites, which was a good news, but in most sites, the high vigor sites in the valley floor, no period 3. So that's the potential for larger berries, which Nova confirmed. What it means also is that those conditions are conducive to boosting the variabilities between sites. We will have more heterogeneity. We will have more sites that performs very well in years where those sites were not performing well because they were too weak, or berry exposure to sun or high temperature was too high because canopy wasn't developing high enough. And we'll have the high vigor sites that will just be those lushy, brushy vines that will prevent maturation from happening early, that will prevent color accumulation to be stopped when we harvest. So with that, I think I'm going to make a pause. We understood how stage 2 and stage 3 set up the game for fruit maturation. I make a pause.
We have time for a little bit of question, actually, Thibaut.
Okay, cool.
Maybe we can pause you for a second. So one question is, how do you think late rain and explosive leaf area growth in late period 2 of 2019 will impact 2020?
Higher bud fertility. If the conditions around set in 2020 are good, the stage is set for having a similar crop load. Why? Because we had no nitrogen deficit, we had no water deficit. So inside the compound buds right now, the embryos have set up themselves for a high bud fertility, so on average more bunches per buds, and greater cluster size. But now what may completely go against what I'm saying are the conditions around a set. But provided set is optimum, the conditions from last year are conducive to a potential that is rather on the high side than on the low side.
Okay, Thibaut, many vineyards had tilled their annual cover crop prior to the May rain. Can you speculate how this influenced the crop in 2020 versus if they had not tilled?
So tilling the cover crop in May means less competitive effect coming from the cover crop during these explosive leaf area developments. So by tilling it earlier, you probably ended up with even larger leaf area on high vigor sites. That would be my...
Okay, and then the last question is, what paper by Luca?
Sorry?
What paper by Luca Brillante?
He's going to be here. He moderates the...
Yeah, you can ask him yourself. I mean, he'll be here in 5 minutes or something. So.
Yeah. But it's his paper on how radiations drives flavonoid content. And I just quote him, but I could have quoted many other people. It's just because I know this paper was published not so long ago, and he's going to be here. So.
Okay. Anybody else have a question? Hang on, Scott.
So just an observation from the work we did with Nova. In 2018, they had smaller berries, about 20% higher anthocyanins, and the anthocyanins peaked 50 days after the beginning of veraison. In 2019, the berries were about 10% larger, 15% lower in anthocyanin, and the peak anthocyanin was at 35 days after the beginning of veraison.
Thank you. I'm going to touch base on that in the next part of the season, but it makes sense.
Okay, anybody else? One last question? Okay, let me run over there.
So you said that for the vigorous site, 2019, we had a high water reserve in the soil and an explosion of a very big surface of leaf. The leaf area was very important. But how do you manipulate the, Because if you you reduce the size of this leaf area, you save water in the ground because there's less transpiration.
Yes.
But on the other side, you said that it was important to expose the fruit to the sunlight earlier in the season.
Yes.
So how do you see, there's a...
yeah.
If we save water in the ground, that means later in period, I guess in period number 4, it's going to continue to grow. So
At this point, it's a trade-off. What is the least bad solution?
Yeah.
Would you rather completely forget about having any water stress, but you get a bit more cluster exposure because you reduce the transpiring leaf area, so you have more light penetrating the fruiting zone, and you boost a little bit your flavonol potential, but you have no benefit from the water deficit?
Yeah.
Or do you postpone the reduction in transpiring leaf area, hoping to get some benefit of water deficit, but the catch-22 is that this water deficit needs to kick in before veraison. If it kicks in after veraison, then actually it's the opposite effect. It may induce some sugar-loading blockages, which Cecilia is going to speak in a minute. So pick up your battle is kind of where you're left at. And I don't know. And this is really a winemaker and a vineyard manager's choices at this point, and it's a matter of production strategies. I can only show this information and then try to pick up the least bad outcome, but it's a hard question.